The city was already loud when the helicopters lifted, a noise of horns and engines and goats and voices that rose from the streets like heat. The rotors cut through it, dust peeling off rooftops in sheets as the birds curved low over Bakara Market. In the lead, the pilot watched the slant of the sun against the corrugated tin and the narrow alleys that ran like veins through the neighborhood. He kept one hand on the collective and the other steady on the cyclic, and felt the ship answer him like a nervous horse. Below, a column of Humvees and 5-ton trucks rolled out from the airfield. Rangers with dark goggles and set jaws, scanning doorways that could turn into barrels in a blink. The target was close, a tan house with a courtyard, where men loyal to Mohammed Farah Aidid gathered to plan and to boast. The order was simple. Go in fast, grab the lieutenants, and get everyone out before the city woke fully to the sound of Americans in its throat. Delta operators dropped by fast rope into the dust of the courtyard. Rangers slid to the street and formed a perimeter, boots finding purchase on broken stone and grit. The first door came off its hinges in a puff of plaster. The men inside shouted, reached for rifles, and found muzzles already on them. The air tasted like chalk and sweat. On the net, voices called positions clipped and calm. Objective secure. Package in custody. It had taken minutes. It should have taken only a little more to leave. Then the first rocket-propelled grenade arced into the sky, a beer bottle shape against the light, and all the math changed. A Black Hawk took the hit, Super 61. The pilot's last words were steady, then cut off. The helicopter rolled and fell into a spiderweb of alleys 2 blocks from the target, its rotors taking the corners off buildings before digging into the street. Flames started at the base of the transmission, licking outward with a speed that made men curse out loud. Rangers sprinted toward the smoke. Delta moved to seal avenues, and the trucks shifted to a new point they hadn't rehearsed. The city moved, too. Men ran from doorways with weapons. Boys ran with them. Women pulled children inside and watched from behind cloth. Gunfire came from 100 angles at once, and it came at ankle height and window height and roofline height because the shooters knew these streets and knew where a man's shoulder would be if he tried to cross. The Rangers' line bent into cover at walls and burned out cars. A medic went to his knees over a kid with a wound that shouldn't have been fatal and worked until it was no use. The radio was a constant inside everyone's ear, a pressure of requests and warnings and bearings given in degrees. A second rocket found another bird, Super 64. The pilot fought her all the way down and put her into the maze with more control than anyone had a right to manage under that kind of hit. The crew survived the crash, but the tail boom snapped and a crowd gathered fast. From another helicopter overhead, 2 Delta snipers asked 3 times to be put down to protect the site. They knew what would happen if no one stood between the crew and the city. The third request came with the understanding that help might not reach them in time. They roped in with rifles and a bag of ammo and took positions that gave them narrow angles and little else. They worked those angles as if each round were a promise. When the magazines were empty and their world had narrowed to one last reload and then one last round, the crowd pushed in. The pilot from Super 64 was pulled out alive. He would live to remember the sound of men fighting for him until there were none left to fight. On the ground, convoys trying to reach both crash sites found their map turning into something else under their tires. Streets that looked broad on paper narrowed to pinches where a burned-up bus or a stolen car had been pushed across. Corners you could take during daylight turned into choke points when gunfire came from stacked rooms, and each second spent deciding which way around a pile of stone meant another second a gunner was up in a turret taking rounds from 3 directions. An RPG slammed the hood of a Humvee and blew a hole large enough to see the dust through. A driver pushed anyway, steering by bursts. A ranger banged the feed tray back into place and fired until his gloves smoked. The first rescue team reached Super 61 and found a landscape made of blades and sheet metal, the air hot enough to sting the inside of your nose. They pulled bodies out with care a battlefield rarely affords. Then the surround began to close in earnest, the circle not of rangers but of fighters who knew the alleys and rooftops like an old route to water. The rescue team fell back, step by deliberate step, lifting a stretcher through a hail that didn't pause long enough to hear a word like pause. Someone shouted they were down to last magazines. Someone else said help was on the way and meant it, even if the streets argued otherwise. Night came without cooling the city. Tracer fire wrote red and green lines above rooftops. Convoys wandered labyrinths, turned around under contact, and tried again. A helicopter overhead called shots for the men below, speaking in block names and directions that meant something only if you'd walked each alley at noon. When radio batteries died, runners carried word mouth to mouth. In one building, rangers holed up with families who couldn't leave and didn't know whether to trust the men who had knocked their door in to get upstairs to a better field of fire. A father kept his hands where the soldiers could see them and brought water for a kid whose chin was shaking. In the stairwell, blood made the steps slick. All night the city tested the lines. Fighters came in waves, then in singles, then as ghosts with a lucky angle. The Americans held pockets around the target house, around the crash of Super 61, and around a hard knot of streets near Super 64 that they couldn't break into and couldn't abandon. The pilots overhead watched their clocks and fuel and prayed for the sky to hold. On the ground, a sergeant counted heads and counted ammunition and looked at the stacks that would run out first. No one slept. No one sat. At dawn, rescue came with armor from coalition units that could push where trucks could not. The tanks and armored personnel carriers bullied space out of streets that had done nothing but deny it since afternoon. The men inside were calm in the way of people who have learned that panic is a kind of weather you can choose not to stand in. They reached the pockets one by one, doors cracking open long enough for Rangers and Delta to load wounded and dead. Gear that couldn't be carried was smashed. Paper was set alight. At Super 64's site, there was no one left to recover but the bodies of men who had made a stand for a pilot they didn't know. The pilot was already gone, taken into the city, and his world had narrowed to a room and negotiations that would last long enough for him to make it home eventually. The push back to the stadium became what the men later called the Mogadishu Mile. Some ran beside the armor because there was no room inside. Others clung to handholds and tried to keep their feet off tires as the vehicles lurched. They moved through a city suddenly full of faces again, most watching, some shouting. You could hear the metal knock of a tracked vehicle hit a manhole cover and ring, and then the different, ugly sound of a bullet striking armor, like a fist on a door. A private ran with his helmet tilted back because sweat had stung his eyes raw. A squad leader tried to keep a formation on a street that wouldn't hold a straight line even on a good day. When the gate closed behind the last vehicle, the stadium felt as quiet as a church. Men counted each other and found who they had and who they didn't. Medics went triage cold, touching wrists and making decisions they'd carry for years. Someone sat with his back to a wall and stared at nothing with both hands clasped, as if holding the idea of still being alive required force. On tables and floors, helmets and rifles and shoulder patches lay in small piles, gritty with dust, that would stick forever to anything it touched that day. The world saw what happened through a handful of photographs and a few terrible minutes of video. A body of an American soldier dragged through a street, stripped of its uniform, the crowd gathered around it, like a storm that circles back on itself. The image cut from televisions into living rooms far away and planted there a feeling that didn't leave. Politicians reached for words that could make sense of it and found fewer than they needed. Families watched with their hands over their mouths, trying not to believe what they could see against their own will. The numbers would be counted and written down: the dead, the wounded, the missing. The names of 2 men who asked to go where the fight was worst to protect a pilot. The names of pilots who rode their birds into the ground trying to keep them whole. Crews who held their positions until they had no positions left to hold. The city kept its own count in graveyards and in the stories people told on stoops after dark. The mission that began with a clear door and a handful of flex cuffs ended with a city awake and angry and a line of vehicles pushing toward a gate everyone had dreamed about since the first RPG hit. Years later, the men who were there would talk about the smell first: hot metal, burning rubber, concrete dust that felt like grit under your eyelids for days. They'd talk about the rhythm of gunfire from 1,000 directions and the weird, clean quiet inside a stairwell where a man could hear his own breath between bursts. They'd talk about the weight of a friend's shoulder over your arm and the long seconds required to lift him into a truck that was already moving. They'd talk about a morning that seemed built for a fast mission and an early dinner and how it tilted without warning into something that looked like the end of the world from ground level. Nothing about the fight felt like victory, and nothing about it felt like defeat to the men who had to live inside those hours. It felt like doing a job until you either finished it or couldn't. It felt like the limits of training run hard against the limits of a city that could swallow roads and intentions without blinking. When they left, they carried more than gear. They carried names and flashes of rooms and rooftops and the weight of what it means to go after someone and find yourself fighting an entire place instead. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.